Picture in your mind's eye that you're walking along a cold winter street. There's a bitter wind and it stings your cheeks. The frost and the slush upon the ground indicate that the coming day isn't going to be much warmer either. Do you have that scene fixed in your mind's eye? Okay, now pan the mental camera out a little further. On the far side of the street is a clearly homeless person. They're covered in frost too. They've obviously been there all night. What little they do have seems to be scattered about them, as if during the struggle to get through to the morning they'd somehow desperately clung and nearly lost even those little possessions. Now, what would be the decent, progressive thing to do? There's the reality, there before your eyes. What should you do about it? If you answered, tell them if you just had a positive attitude, someone would be bound to come along and wipe the snow off. Or if you thought, you'd say, you're not really homeless or cold, you're just a hater. Or even, you're white, male, Western, delete as appropriate, you don't really have any problems. Then you must be at home, nice and warm, and posting online in comfort, because any decent person would recognise such a reaction in the face of that reality would be horrendous. You would recognise that if someone tells you something is wrong and your reaction is to defend the state of the street rather than help lift up the person trying to live on that street, then you're not a good person. And yet, online, where fan culture is concerned, and in modern mass media, the opposite is held to be true. Imagining the good you do is far more important than actually listening, identifying and doing that good. We seem to have a generation of people who want the label of liberal to feel good about themselves without doing any of the hard work for anyone else that goes with it. And it is hard work. It's often messy and disgusting and involves things you'd rather not be involved with. But if it didn't, if it was fun to see and felt good to do, then it wouldn't need you to change the conditions in the first place. Have you ever actually done care work? I have, and still do. People often tell me that. It must be very satisfying. It's not, and it shouldn't be. Let's sit and stare at some shit for a while, shall we? You'll run into our familiar friend here often if you do this kind of work. Inside the incontinence pads of people dying from dementia, between the buttocks of the disabled who can't reach it. And shit is what it is. You can't tell somebody that it's not there when they can feel it pressed against their skin. You can't tell them it's a wonderful opportunity to muse upon the natural world. It's a stinking, unpleasant pile of their own waste. Their reality, there and then, is that they have shit themselves. They don't exist to make you feel better about yourself. You exist and do the job you're expected to do to make it better for them. So why am I talking about it now? Well, the motivations for this video have been kicking around in the back of my head for quite a while now, both political and personal. Certainly the election of Trump kickstarted it again recently, but not so much for that fact, but rather for the kind of liberal culture that allowed him to succeed, the kind that ignored the hard challenges of trying to understand people that they saw as deplorables, and just expected to feel good about themselves instead, talk amongst themselves, and then somehow win the election without appealing to anyone but themselves. And don't get me wrong, I'm not under any illusions about actually liking, on a personal level, the typical trumpeter. But that's not the point. If you don't ever try and help them, they're never going to like, let alone be like you. They will remain mired in the genuine problems that they have and that need to be addressed. Think back to our homeless person again. If you're judging your willingness to be sympathetic on how sympathetic they feel to you, then you're not sympathetic. Not really. Think back to the pile of shit. If they can't shift it, and you won't, then who will? Let me divert into some first-hand experience. I grew up under Thatcher in the 1980s UK, and amongst the collapse of the local economy with the destruction of the coal industry. Many of my childhood memories of breaking into abandoned colliery offices and scaring each other with ghost tales of dead miners. And when the pits went, so did all the associated businesses, the catering, the transport, the public houses. You would think then, in the face of shared hardship, you'd have solidarity, yes? But instead, when people are beaten down, they look for someone even lower to kick. I can still remember the National Front graffiti that was all over the decaying railway bridges. Neo-fascist parties blaming immigrants in an area that literally had only a single Pakistani family living there. Which, of course, as somebody truly liberal, their son was a good friend of mine during college. Although I didn't even think about the symbolism of it back then. I just got on with him without thinking. Whilst meanwhile, the kind of people who were supposedly mine, white working class, were busy getting drunk and knifing each other just as something to do on a Saturday night. So yes, I went on all the anti-racism marches. I met my local MP, who suggested going to university to get a degree, to become a political researcher, to help change the local culture of violence and hate and the depressing waste of human potential. And when I got to university, we all marched again on the same marches and talked to the right people about the right things, reinforced each other whilst dancing to Pulp's Common People in the student union, but never bothered much about talking to the townies in the actual working class area around our university. And why would we? They hated us for gentrifying their areas, taking over their nightclubs, and we hated them because they were so unpleasant to be around and didn't know what they were talking about. And afterwards, some of us then went on to work for a while in politics, and most of us got lovely middle-class jobs in lovely industries in the capital or in the areas that still had employment. And that same town, however, continued to see industrial decay over the decades since, and recently was one of the boroughs that went most heavily for the self-destruction that is Brexit. Because, for all our right-on thoughts, we never actually did any good for the people who needed it. The Member of Parliament who suggested the best personal route to change was later caught up in the cash for influence scandal, because public service just wasn't earning him enough money. Cheers for being a symbol of my young hope and older disillusionment, Jeff. Politics failed and keeps failing because people are more concerned with their own quality of life than actually dealing with what creates the deplorables. That's just no fun, and it just doesn't earn enough. Brexit predicted it, and electing Trump was the predicted and identical response to the fact that so-called liberals just weren't really listening. It's a stupid response again, just like Brexit, but Hillary was such an awful candidate, and the desperation building in the United States should have been so obvious that people were reaching breaking point. But the liberal blogosphere didn't, and still, by blaming Russia for everything, still isn't listening. It's just so much easier to write the voters off as racist, stupid, violent or manipulated by Russia than try and lift them up, especially when you might not get any thanks for doing it. But if you're doing it for the thanks, or for feeling good, you're not actually working for change. You're not. Change is hard, and it means changing yourself and doing things that you don't want to do, amongst people you often won't like. But anything else is just narcissism. Somewhat as an aside, but it's another political example, I had to laugh recently with the drama of Emma Watson not understanding why she was being attacked by quotation marks feminists for going nearly topless. Because, true equality would treat men and women as truly equal and accept that there are awful women perverting their own politics just as often as awful men pollute their own. And for a lot of these awful women, feminism, quotation marks, isn't about freedom of sexual expression, but reinforcing Mean Girls' sexual segregation. It's about keeping those gross, disgusting nice guys out of the dating pool. And by giving deplorables something to masturbate to, you were letting, quotation marks, feminism down, Emma, so now you're off the feminist list. As if the greatest crime in the world was that some ugly guy should ever have a moment of pleasure near the beautiful people. That it's far more important to think of yourself as beautiful by having such beautiful thoughts and slapping the label of liberation on yourself than actually working to make things beautiful for other people. And yes, I know who that couple was. I deliberately chose them for the contrast between what Salman Rushdie has crafted and what he first looks like when stood next to those beautiful people. If you put your own sense of aesthetics before doing the actual hard work of actually being a beautiful person, you're not one. You're really not. The other area where this topic has been in the back of my mind, though, is fan culture. In particular, if you've ever crowdfunded a game, you've run into this phenomena just as I since have. People who treat the gaming industry as if they're actual friends, who invest all their hopes and dreams into the promises made, but treat anyone who challenges these dreams as if they're deplorable again. rather than try and understand if the product is actually treating its backers fairly. My own experience of this comes from a game called Shroud of the Avatar, a game I originally supported but which has largely gone off the rails since. And the worst enemy of the development isn't the sociopathic jammers playing at harassing people with doubts for years, even going as far as to try and release their personal information. Nope, you can always expect seriously broken people online. That's just part of the shit we have to deal with. No, once more, the real problem is the kind of person who just assumes defending something automatically makes them good, because positivity is somehow better than cleaning up the mess. And then they leave the mess behind. In this particular case, I've gone into great detail elsewhere about many of the issues with this project, in videos you can see on my YouTube channel. But let's just talk about one in particular. If you backed the game at Kickstarter, you were told at certain pledge levels you would get episodes 2 to 5 as well. Now, because they've handled the funding so badly, even episode 2 will require a second successful Kickstarter before they'll attempt to develop it. That is, they now expect you to pay them a second time before they'll try and provide content you've already paid for. Not guarantee it, just start the development process again. Now, in what moral universe is that acceptable? To create a contract and commitment and then renegotiate it for more money later, using the fear that you'll never get it otherwise. And yet, to those who consider themselves fans, believing in the goodwill of the developers and ignoring the actual actions of the development team is seen as doing good. And attacking people, labelling them as deplorable when they complain about this, is somehow being a good person. Not acting to make the product better, not doing the hard work to face the shitty reality, and then going elbow deep into it to try and clean it up, just refusing to let anyone talk about what they actually experience with it. And even then, they might not get the second episode anyway, because despite ignoring it, you didn't change the fact that no one else wants to fund it a second time around. You see the results of this toxic positivity, quotation marks there of course, across the whole industry now. The constant chipping away of not just the value for money provided, but the literal ignoring of your legal and consumer and contractual rights based upon nothing more than that there are people so in love with the industry and its products that they'll tolerate any abuse, justify any immoral action, and click and accept any possible EULA just so they can spend one more moment daydreaming about what they might get tomorrow. Now, compared to being the last person with someone just before they die, it's a relatively small thing, admittedly. Compared to the horrors of the Trump administration, it's perhaps not the most important fight to have right now. But what's so staggering about it is that even where it's not of life-changing consequence, people can't resist putting their own sense of personal hippiedom, of being positivity Jesus, but without the sacrifice or suffering, before actually ensuring results even for themselves, even in a hobby. We've actually willingly embraced the idea that even our escapism from the difficulties of the real world should be a playground for financial and moral mischief, and that anyone who protests that is entitled. But yes, we are entitled. Everyone is entitled to the right to express their discontent, even when it comes to something as simple as the gaming industry. Because how else do you ever expect it to get addressed? And you're not a caring individual just because you go to a happy place inside your own head and imagine that you are. Not whilst the industry is under no obligation to think of you so sympathetically, and when it clearly isn't. And not whilst you still leave those dubious practices unaddressed. Not whilst you're effectively still walking past the person on the street because it's such a pain to deal with their negative experiences. But you have to work to identify, then remove the source of suffering to be a really good person every day. Get up and know that you've got a long, miserable, shit-filled fight to clear the world up, one stool at a time. But if you won't do it, who will? The world doesn't need dreamers like that, not unless you also get up and do something. Open your eyes to the horror. Open your eyes to the shit, then get all up in that shit and change it.